Thank you very much, David Fryer, for your insightful talk. And thanks again for joining us for the discussion. A very warm welcome from my side. Also welcome to all our participants. Please, if you have already attended some talks, you are familiar with the Q&A tool. If not, you will find it on the bottom menu bar of your screen. Please send in your questions to actively participate, and I will read out the questions to David, and we will try to be in a discussion and conversation together. David, please join us for the discussion.
Hello.
Hello. Thanks for joining us.
Good evening from Australia.
Good morning from Cairo, actually. That's the interesting part of this conference. So we are all in different spaces and also time zones, but we managed to come together. So thanks again for your insightful talk. I found it very helpful. You structured it in a way of asking questions instead of giving answers. And while the questions are coming in, I would like to start with one question myself, if I may. So you've discussed yourself that we cannot reduce complexity down to the point where nothing has meaning anymore in psychological research, right? And that's what's happening in traditional psychology on a daily basis, to reduce complexity down to a point where we have like small bits and pieces, but no meaning in it. So unemployment in mainstream psychology is actually a topic, right? There is research done and there's tons of interventions planned. And you pointed out some of them and where they come from, and that they're trying to fit the individual into a flawed system, and that they are pathologizing unemployment, etc. So one aspect I find particularly alarming, that is, we know that it's not just unemployment per se, but the economic insecurity that it causes mental health problems. And we could, that's what you suggested, detach unemployment from economic security, if I understood you correctly. So if we know that economic security is a protective factor for mental health, why not discussing different measures to increase economic security for individuals? Basic income, for example. I haven't heard a lot of psychologists discussing that.
Okay, thank you, Irene. The situation actually is even worse than we're suggesting, because most of the interventions which are mobilized or deployed in order to reduce unemployment, of course, they position the cause of unemployment as being in the psyche of the unemployed person rather than the lack of adequate, decent jobs and whatever. But most of the interventions come along with aspects which are specifically designed to increase economic insecurity. So, for example, with the Job Active program, there are sanctions which can fine people basically for not behaving in the way that's approved. Or there are threats to income, or there are suspensions to income, or it's delayed, or whatever else that was going on. So I think that one of the points in the talk is that I believe, because I've been working in this for a very long period of time, I've spoken to a very large number of unemployed people. I believe that unemployment is a caustic, toxic experience for people. Not for everybody, but for many people. But I'm completely unhappy with the mechanisms by which the claims that unemployment causes distress, and the way in which distress and the way in which the unemployed person are positioned are actually managed through the mainstream. So if you like, let's say, for example, for an anti-capitalist who wishes to accept that mass unemployment created by neoliberal capitalism produces illness and unhappiness and potentially death, because there already predictions are going now of suicide rates and parasuicide rates. Suicide rates, 10,000 predicted coming up, and 100,000 parasuicide cases. So if you're an anti-capitalist and you wish to find a way to understand and critique what's going on and the way in which unemployment is used as an instrument of economic control and controlling the in-work employed and such like, but you want to reject the positivist biomedical modernist way of doing it, then we've got to find new ways. And certainly if, as we expect other things being equal, this has been a theme from other speakers too, if business as usual is rolled out to deal with the unemployment that's going to be created, and it's going to be catastrophically huge unemployment, according to the ILO and the OECD and the rest of it, then we can expect that to make the impact even worse. And we can expect it to use activation programs which are linked with financial insecurity and financial penalties. So we're in a situation where we know that unemployment is going to be astronomical. We know that unemployment, or we believe that unemployment is destructive, but we're looking to find ways, A, not to reproduce the interventions from the past, and B, not to have to legitimate mainstream Psy as a means of showing that impact.
Do we need a new definition of unemployment in order to do critical research?
I think that the way in which unemployment is operationalized and defined is certainly problematic. So this, as I said in my talk, it involves, you only count as unemployed if you're actively involved in job search. But if we believe the mainstream literature, or we believe those phenomena, even if we want to justify them in a different fashion, people will be discouraged from looking for work, especially work which doesn't exist. You know, huge numbers of people looking for jobs that don't exist at the moment. So we need to approach it differently. But I've chosen to talk about unemployment in this talk because it's something that I've been working on for 40 years, and I have some things that I wanted to try and communicate. But already, actually, unemployment has also become underemployment. So the hidden unemployment in underemployment is ideal for employers and for the state, because here you have, in a sense, a reserve army of labor that's desperate to get more work because they can't survive on what they've got, but they're already being produced as compliant workers within the workplace. So really, I think we need to think in terms not just of unemployment, but underemployment, the gig economy, zero contract hours, and all of that sort of stuff. But the talk that I've given has tried to offer a critique of the way Psy has approached this and the way it's minimized the role of financial insecurity and the role of previous jobs and such like. But this approach works for all of these different aspects of labor market experience. We can do the same thing in other areas if we want to. It's the neat little thing to have done to put this critique, this approach through, I think. That's my hope anyway.
I think you've pointed wonderfully out in your talk that the master narrative, or the debate of this crisis, is one saying it's apolitical, it's a biomedical crisis, the consequence of a natural new virus. So a part of the population is depicted as without resistance. They are forced into a passive state, don't do anything, don't leave the house, don't go to the grocery. I do not want to question those measures at this point, but they are dominating the public discourse, at least of how parts of the population are addressed, right? And as vulnerable. So my question would be, in or also after the COVID-19 crisis, whatever and whenever this after will be and how it will look like, do you have any ideas how work and employment, as opposed to unemployment, our ways of working will change on a long-term run, and our ways of thinking about employment and work?
Well, I think other things being equal, we would expect a continuation of the transformation of work that we've seen already, really. So there will be less and less full-time, trades union protected, secure work, which is in decent working circumstances with an element of collective control over what goes on. We can see that as disappearing, and more insecure part-time underemployment, which will be created. I just assume that that is the case. And actually, all of these different phenomena, we already know quite a bit about them because, for example, on the longitudinal studies that followed people from employment into unemployment, they looked at the whole transition. We looked at the whole transition, and the period of anticipation of job loss was as corrosive as any of them. Lots of people get, of course, locked into the labor market in insecurity, anticipating unemployment, but it never occurs and such like. So, but I think that that isn't really the burden of the talk. The burden of the talk really was the way in which the literature is an example of psi and the psi complex, which is problematic in almost every respect, except for the fact that it has produced, I mean, my personal collection of research papers is well over 1,000. I stopped when I got to 1,000, but it's absolutely vast literature. And the unanimity and the convergent validity, if you like those terms from mainstream psychology, it's absolutely huge. In fact, it's quite bizarre because it turns out that the experience of unemployment in 1930s Vienna, or just outside Vienna, is very, amongst Austrians, obviously, is not that dissimilar from the experience of Australians in 2020. And yet, so here you've got this weird inversion of replication, where replication normally, if a phenomenon stays the same, then you expect the experience to be the same. But here you've got a phenomenon that's changed massively, but the experience is just the same. That suggests to me that there are ideological functions being served by the experience of unemployment, and therefore that the experience of unemployment and the experience of becoming unhappy and ill, risk, excuse me, in a range of ways, excuse me, is something which is constructed and constituted because it works well, really. So for those of us that would like to transform the experience of unemployment, for example, very rich people, Boris Johnson's mates, they can manage without employment quite happily, without any of the psychological consequences of them. It's when unemployment is combined with financial insecurity, stigma, and being processed by organs and bureaucracies of the state that it becomes really problematic for people.
Absolutely.
And they will resist. Unemployment has to exist. In fact, there's a term developed by economists called NIRU, non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, which is about 5.4%, which has to be maintained. Mass unemployment of 5.5% or so has to be maintained in order to stop inflation and to control the in-work employed. So there'll be a scramble because we're looking at much higher levels of that, and there'll be an attempt to bring it down, but there'll be no attempt to bring it right down below that 5%, because without that, then the boot is on the other foot, and workers start to have more power to control the nature of the working experience.
Absolutely, thank you. I would like to continue with a question from the audience. Gordana is saying, thank you so much, David, for your critical, engaged and talk. I think it is very important to denaturalize psychological phenomena and de-psychologize social phenomena. Your analysis, I should be followed. As an affected person, I'm especially grateful to you, if I may add a personal note. It is more a comment than a question, right?
No, but that's good. I appreciate hearing that feedback. Thank you.
And I would like to continue with another question. You were telling me, like when we were talking about this conference, and I was telling you, I will introduce you about your own employment experiences many, many years ago. And that was a relevant experience for your later work, without saying that this is a necessary experience, but a relevant experience in your biography. And that's what we often do when we do community psychology and ethnographic research, to position ourselves and our experiences and reflect thoroughly where we are coming from ourselves, right? So could we, like, for a moment, look at our own field of employment and work, academia? So there is a tsunami of unemployment around the world, also in academia. How do we react to this or critically research this? For example, at the conference like this, small colleges shutting down, the coronavirus crisis being used to justify austerity politics within university, hiring freezes, more positions or far less positions for young postdocs. So how do we, as critical scholars, how do we deal with this within our own field?
Right. Well, that's a hell of a question. I think we are seeing the casualization of academia. If I just touch back on the personal experience, so I don't position my earlier experience as being typical in any sort of fashion, but it was certainly a moment of refocusing and motivating, which has lasted for 4 decades of anger and interest in the issue of what unemployment does to people. But for example, due to my own critical work, I've been, my teaching's been closed down in one place. I was made redundant from another. I've been sacked from journal editorships, and I put it down to engaging in critique. And I think if one looks at the critical community, then voices which speak up for critique are being snuffed out repeatedly, one after another. And in a way, I consider it to be a sort of compliment to be silenced, because you're not silenced if what you're saying doesn't matter. But in my own work now, all of my work, I'm outside the academic world. I have an honorary position, but I do sessional teaching. That sessional teaching can be closed down at a moment's notice if the class size disappears. So this sort of transition into a period of chronic insecurity and the potential for silencing and removal, I think is a hugely problematic one, not just because academics, like anybody else, deserve to have some sort of stability and security and not to be made sick or unhappy by their workplace. I mean, that applies to absolutely everybody. But I think that the ways in which this flexibility for the employer operates, it makes it extremely easy to keep closing down alternative ways of understanding and critique. In other words, that it also, for those of us that are involved in psychology or anti-psychology in some sort of way, it increases opportunities for the narrowing of the discipline and the way it's taught and the research that's done in a narrower and narrower way, which is ideologically problematic. So, that within the workplace, we have the traditional means of trying to organize, but within Australia, the trades unions have just agreed to take a considerable pay cut for academics in order to trade that off against more unemployment amongst academics. And it puts us into a very difficult situation, I think, where we're having to trade security and income, and people have rent to pay and houses to, mortgages to pay for, and food and family to feed and all the rest of it. It's a hugely problematic area for the health and happiness of academics and the casualization of the academic workforce. But it's also something which is taken advantage of, in my view, to root out and to fill it out critical approaches and to reduce the possibilities of students in academic institutions learning about critical perspectives. Of course, some material is taught as if it's critical, but then there's a recuperation. So what often gets taught as critical is not particularly threatening to the interests of the status quo, and then that can persist.
Yeah, thank you very much. Another question in the audience. Martin is saying, are you looking at unemployed as systemic, necessary to stabilize neoliberal capitalism? And if so, what do we do ideally? Improve the situation of the unemployed? Do away with the current economic system? Where do we start?
Well, I think it's important to take a systemic view and to look at the functions which are served by unemployment. if unemployment didn't serve positive functions for those with the capacity to reduce it, it wouldn't occur. So obviously, an amount of mass unemployment functions in a whole set of different ways. It creates a group that can be pointed to as feckless and idle in order to dignify their Protestant work ethic or the work ethic of those in work. So they become a contrast to not be like. They act as an incomes policy. They reduce the chances of people working collectively to improve the quality of work. They provide a group of people who can't afford not to consume substandard products and all the range of it. So when we're looking at, if you like, and I stick to this theme, when we look at the mainstream psychological literature showing that unemployment is bad for your mental health, that also, in a sense, functions as an instrument of social control, because nobody wants to become, there's a phrase, you know, you've lost your job, now you're losing your mind. This idea that somehow producing unemployment as purely and necessarily negative it's an instrument of control, and it's problematic. So as soon as we start to move around and to say, well, unemployment as it's currently constituted, as the unemployed subject is constituted to be unhappy and to be unwell and to be at risk of a whole range of factors like suicide and parasite and suicide and such like, as we move to that, we can see that what has been constituted can be reconstituted differently. And it is possible to think of ways in which unemployment could be made more bearable. For example, one research project that I was involved in some time ago now worked with a trades union to look at what happened when the company was faced with having to make a proportion of the workforce redundant. What the trades union managed to argue for and achieve here was a period of temporary layoffs for the workforce. So people were unemployed for 2 or 3 months, but they had a guarantee of going back into their jobs. So at any one time, a third of the workforce was not in employment. And what we did was to look at the people who were having this temporary layoff and compare them with the experience of other people who were broadly similar, but they had been made permanently unemployed. And at the time when the permanently unemployed group were exhibiting all of the corrosive experience of unemployment that we're talking about, the temporarily laid off people were healthier, happier, engaging in all sorts of activities and such like. So it was almost like a sort of empirical demonstration of job share. And there are ways in which we can deal with these phenomena and ways in which we can evaluate them, which within the mainstream at least, which can be useful. So yes, I'm not if you like, able to make predictions about how things will be developed, but I think we know from where we are that if things develop as they have been so far, we're looking at a situation which is likely to be entrapping and caustic and extremely difficult for people to deal with. And we're actually talking about millions and millions of people now who are being subject to these apparent risks.
Absolutely. I think we have time for one more question. Gordana says, may I add a question? What do you think of a former socialist model of employment, which includes some aspects of rights to work and a kind of more equal distribution of available jobs? An additional aspect, at least in the case of former Yugoslavia, there was a system of self-management, which meant inclusion of workers into decision-making. What do you think of those models of employment?
I'm not familiar with them, Gordana, but any approach to dealing with unemployment which is involves the participatory decision-making of unemployed people, in a sense, has to be along the right lines. One of the troubles for me, I tried to indicate it in my talk, is that because of the subjective reconstitution of unemployed people, and this is a Foucauldian sense that unemployed people, like others, come to be governed by their own understandings of themselves and their potential options for activity or inactivity. So involving people in participatory decision-making, to me, isn't the end of the story, because the experience of an unemployed person that might be participating, or a worker who is under threat, itself has a genealogy, and it's a moment in which governmentality has been operating on and through people. So there's a difficult issue here. It's part of this whole thing of wanting to resist the potential of identifying lived experience as being somehow an untainted basic origin point for action, because I see lived experience as being at the end of a process of subjective reconstitution and governmentality, in which case it complicates the matter of participatory decision-making by people. Not to say that it's not possible, but it seems to me to need to take place within some sort of process of critical reflexivity, which allows people to think in terms of options which they may not otherwise have. So it sounds an interesting idea. I don't know much about it at the moment, but thank you for the point.
Thank you so much, David, again, for your wonderful talk and the wonderful discussion. I would love to invite everyone to continue this discussion wherever you are, or if you would like to join us on our conference Slack, I would be happy to further discuss with you, and hopefully also David, unemployment and the current crisis. Also, we can take the opportunity. There is a panel where we will discuss about unemployment today, later today. I would like to invite you to also. Thank you so much, David, for joining us, and thanks to everyone for their great questions. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Irene.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye. Take care.